Today is the first Sunday in Advent, and therefore is the beginning of a new Christian Catholic liturgical year. And as you notice, the color for Advent is purple, and that is a sign of penitence. We go into 4 weeks penance before Christmas to prepare for the great festival of God's becoming man at Christmas time. Now, I shall be here for the next 2 Sundays, next Sunday and the Sunday after. So I shall have the privilege of spending 3 out of the 4 Sundays of Advent here with you in St. Paul, in this very dear congregation of ours. And I want to preach on these 3 Sundays upon the meaning of Advent and on different subjects dealing with Advent. Today I want to take as a subject, what is man? The question of our own identity. And then I want to take also as a subject the whole question of freedom and free will. I want to do that next Sunday. And then the Sunday after, I want to deal with the things I was just reading about in this gospel this morning, about the things which are coming. The second coming of our blessed Lord. In these days in which we're living, I find wherever I go in this country that people are talking about what they call the signs of the times. And people say to me, Father, do you think we're getting toward the end of the world, or what is happening? So many strange things are happening in the world. And I think everybody in the world today feels a certain uneasiness. So I don't know any more than anybody else knows what's going to happen. Nobody can pretend in these days to be a prophet of the future. But I think there are certain things that are in the Bible and in the words of our blessed Lord that we Catholics ought to take note of. And I want to try to deal with some of those things too. Now, I want to make an announcement or two. Next Sunday we are starting with 2 Masses in this church. As you can see, we have a pretty full congregation here this morning. In fact, I think it's just about as full as we can be in this church, which is a very good and gratifying sign. For a long time, I've been saying to the headquarters of the Society of St. Pius X that St. Paul, Minnesota is going to have 2 Masses before long, because the congregations there are very good. And so now we're going to have to start next Sunday. We're going to have 2 Masses, one at 8:30 and one at 10:30. And at first, after a change like this is made, I've seen it in 2 other places. People begin a little bit to be upset because they see that the congregation doesn't seem to be as large because it's now divided into 2. But don't be upset, because what we're going to do now is fill this church twice on Sunday instead of once. And I'm sure that is what's going to happen. And remember that each one of us is an evangelist for the true Roman Catholic faith. We must invite our friends here. We must invite our relatives. If we know of members of this congregation who have lapsed and no longer come here, we must try to get them back. And we must build up here in St. Paul, in the Twin Cities, a large church and congregation of the true Roman Catholic faith, which I'm sure we're going to do. This congregation and the one in Chicago are the 2 that I have the greatest hope for of all the congregations I visit. And I go to quite a few parts of the United States regularly. But this congregation and the one in Chicago are the ones that I feel are our star congregations. And I feel it's always a privilege to come here and be with you. And there's one other thing I want to say. On the matter of confessions, always when I come to the Twin Cities, I come arriving here about midday on Saturday. I think my plane gets in at 1:25. And always on Saturday I have Mass, followed by benediction, followed by confessions. Now, all of you may not know that I always hear confessions here on Saturday. And on Saturdays I can hear confessions right to the end. However many confessions there are, I won't leave this church until I've heard every one. If I have to go on until 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, I'm quite willing to do so. But on Sundays, unfortunately, I have to stop hearing confessions in time for Mass, because I feel I have a contract with the congregation to start Mass on time at 10 o'clock. And next Sunday it'll be 10:30. And also, remember that we priests who come here usually have a pretty tight program. I have to catch a plane at 1 o'clock today to go to Moline, Illinois. And next Sunday when I come here, I have to catch a plane to go to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the Sunday after that, I have to go to Moline again. Sometimes when I leave here, I go to Chicago. So it's always a pretty tight thing on Sundays, and I ask your understanding and indulgence. I hate having to turn people away when they come to confession. It's a thing I really dislike intensely doing. And this morning I had to do so, and sometimes I do, because I simply have to start Mass on time. So if you can come to confession on Saturdays, I would greatly appreciate it. Remember, we always have Mass whenever I'm coming here, and I think it appears on the bulletin. I say Mass at 5, followed by benediction, and after that, confessions, and I always hear them all on Saturdays. So those are the things I wanted to announce. Also, I just want to mention, the 8th of December is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of our Blessed Lady. That is a great and wonderful festival of our Roman Catholic Church. Now, unfortunately, no priest will be able to be here on that day. So on that day, will you say your rosary with special devotion, and if you can, say the Litany of our Blessed Lady, which is the litany you said here this morning after the rosary. God bless all of you. Now, this morning, I want to take the words of the psalmist. The psalmist said, "What is man, Lord, that thou art so mindful of him?" What is man? In other words, what is a human being? Or in other words, who are you and who am I? Now, we may think that we know who we are, but you know we do not really know who we are. You may be John Smith, or you may be Mary Stevens. But do you know who you really are in the sight of God and in the innermost recesses of your being? Man is the most tremendous mystery in the world. Man has been placed on the moon. Wonderful things have been done in science. The most amazing improvements have been made in the way we live and the speed at which we travel. But the great fundamental mystery of our human existence is, who am I? Who are you? Why are we here? What is it all about? And sometimes when one starts thinking all that, one wonders, what is it all about? Man is a tremendous mystery. Now that question, what is man? It can be given various answers. For example, if a chemist analyzes a human being, he'll say that man is made up pretty much of the same chemical combination as seawater. The same things that are in you and me that are in seawater. So much hydrogen, so much oxygen, so much carbon, and so on. And I remember reading that the total value of a human being, in chemical terms, is 36 cents. In other words, you and I, chemically speaking, are worth 36 cents. Well, inflation now may have changed that a bit. It may now be about 50 cents. Because I read this 5 or 6 years ago, in the old days when things were cheap, or competitively cheap. So chemically, we're not worth much. Then the psychologist takes a look at us. And he said, well, man is consciousness. And man is also subconsciousness. And he tells us certain things about our minds. Or he tells us certain things about that innermost mind, which is below our consciousness, the subconscious. And that's the psychological answer. He tells us that we're consciousness. And if he's a materialist psychologist, he tells us that that is related to our bodies. And that when death comes, consciousness stops, and that is the end. That there's nothing after that. So there are various answers that can be given to that question. Chemically, biologically, psychologically, and so on. Well, now, who are we? The answer of our holy faith, of our holy religion, the answer of Christ, the answer of the Bible, is that man is the image of God. In other words, to understand man, we have to begin with God, not with man. God has told us in His Holy Scriptures and in the revelation which He has given us in Christ, His Son, that we are the image of God. The imago Dei. Now that is one of the greatest things in all of our theology, in all of our holy faith. The image of God. Now we believe profoundly, as Catholics, as Christians, that God created us. In the first chapter of Genesis, we read there the story of creation, that God made the world. He made the great waters. He made the firmament. And He created man and placed him in this world in a garden. Now this whole business today about man's creation is disputed by many modern people. They tell us that the story in Genesis is just a myth. Many of the schools of that church, which used to be Roman Catholic and no longer is, in other words, the Novus Ordo Church, in those schools today, many of the teachers, so-called Roman Catholics, are teaching our children that the Old Testament is just a book of fairy stories. Now, I know that to be a fact. I've heard of various schools, and children have told me that their teachers have told them, they've even given the names of their teachers, or the sister, very often it's a sister, a nun, so-called nun. They tell us that these things are just myths, that they're fairy stories. That story told us there about God creating the world is just a myth. And what they're teaching in many of the schools today, and I include in that especially Novus Ordo schools, is that man and the ape family have a common ancestor, and that we have come to be what we are today through a long process of evolution. Now that is taught in many of our schools, practically all of our schools today, as fact. In other words, probably your children have been taught that. Now nobody can object to theories being taught, so long as they're recognized as theories. And evolution is a theory. It is not a fact. It has never been definitely proved. And whatever may be the facts about evolution, we as Christians, as Catholics, believe that in whatever way He did it, God created man. That, in other words, each individual human being is a creation of God, and not of any process, of any scientific process of evolution. Now, in many of the states of this country, there have been legal battles on this whole subject. A long time ago, in the 1920s, there was a famous trial which took place in a small town in Tennessee called, I believe, Dayton. A teacher there named Scopes had been teaching as a fact in the public schools that man was the result of a process of evolution from lower forms of life. And according to the then laws of the state of Tennessee, this was against the law to teach that as fact and not as a theory. And so there was a famous trial which gained international attention. Reporters converged on this little village in Tennessee from all over the world. And one of the most famous lawyers in this country, whose name was Clarence Darrow, went there and took the side of evolution. And one of the great political figures of this country, William Jennings Bryan, took the opposite side. And these two gigantic figures argued out the whole case of man's creation or evolution from lower forms of life at that little village in Tennessee. And it drew the whole world's attention to it. Now, some of the states of this country, especially southern states, I believe the state of Arkansas and the state of Louisiana, have laws that if evolution is taught in schools, which it is, that creationism must also be taught. But that has been greatly disputed. However, getting back to the main line of the subject I'm talking about, we believe that man is the creation of God, and that man was created in the image of God. Now think what that means. When God created man, man was like God, except that he was not all-powerful. Just as God is immortal, man is also, by creation, immortal. In other words, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were immortal beings. They would have lived forever. There would have been no death. There would have been no pain. Life would have been simply a beautiful life of total communion with God, because they were created in God's own image, in the imago Dei, the image of God. So that is where we begin in Christian thinking, in Catholic thinking, there with that fact of the image of God. Man was made in God's image, Essentially, we should be immortal. We shouldn't have to be fearing death. We shouldn't have to be fearing cancer, or lung cancer, or whatever it may be, all these things that kill, heart trouble. All those things would be alien to our existence if it had not been for a cosmic tragedy that happened shortly after the creation. God gave only one commandment, and that was that of a certain tree our first parents should not eat. And you know the story, it's very familiar. That story which now in so-called Catholic schools is referred to very often as a myth, or as a fairy story. But we believe that essentially that story is true. It's true, the days of creation may have been long, long periods of hundreds of years, I don't know. It's true, there may have been a process of development. But we believe that essentially man is God's unique creation, and that we bear within our souls that spark which unites us indissolubly with God. That we are the image of God, and we begin at that point. But this great tragedy intervened. Mankind fell into sin. And because man fell into sin, man was expelled from the garden. And hence tragedy and pain and death and sin entered into the world. Life could have been so wonderful there in the garden. But mankind, and all of us were there present, potentially in Adam and Eve, mankind chose sin. He chose alienation from God. And so we were driven forth from that garden. But do you know that I think that deep down within us, in what the psychologists would call our subconscious mind, that there is a dim memory there of a garden. And that memory of that garden is deep within inside of each one of us. And that all of us knows that somehow we've fallen from a very high destiny. That we're not what we were intended to be. And that is why man eternally longs for God. Every man, every human being, I believe somewhere in him has a longing for God. A longing to be united with God. A longing to get out of all this misery, all this uncertainty, all this insecurity, and to feel that we're in God's arms, that we're close to the Sacred Heart of our Divine Lord. That longing is there inside of all of us, and we cannot get away from it, however far we wander from God. And so, we begin with the image of God. Now, mankind has strayed a long way from God. Sometimes when we look around us, it's impossible, almost impossible, to feel that everybody is a son of God, potentially, or a daughter of God. I remember some years ago seeing a documentary. I think it was some criminal in Attica prison in New York State. There was a documentary on people in prisons who had committed murder. And one man was brought forth, and he told on this documentary how he loved to kill. I remember his saying that he liked to kill slowly so that he could enjoy each little nuance of it. And I remember I sat there sort of paralyzed with horror, thinking, how could anybody be so horrible as that? That he would love to kill, and he would love to kill slowly so that he could enjoy the suffering and then see them die and get a deep sense of satisfaction. He was a murderer, murdered several people. And then the thought came to me, he cannot possibly be a son of God. Nobody who's a son of God could talk like that. But then I had to recognize that he is, or he was, a son of God. The divine spark might have been very faint, but somewhere even in him there was that image of God. So within each one of us is the image of God. And we all potentially are candidates for heaven. We may not all get there, but each one of us has within himself the possibility of having full union with God in heaven. You know, there's something in all of us that responds to the idea of a garden. Our whole earthly existence began in a garden, the Garden of Eden. It began there in that beautiful garden where man had everything that he wanted, where life was perfect, where there was no unhappiness, no pain, no disease, no death, where man lived there in full communion with God. And there was no struggle whatsoever. Man just naturally flowed along in the life of God. And then sin entered there through Satan. But nevertheless, as I say, I feel that in each one of us there is some memory of that garden. There's something that makes us think that that is our true destiny. That being in the image of God, that we should be there in fullness of life with Him. And here we are, out of the garden, expellees, wandering through this world of pain, this world of sin, this world of death. There is a lot of happiness in this world because it's still God's world, even though we may have, through sin, ruined it. But there is happiness here, there's love here, there's peace here, and Christ has been here, and His Blessed Mother has been here. So there is, even in this world of imperfection, there is happiness and joy and peace at times. But there's also pain. There's also sin. There's also frustration. There's also disappointment. There's also disillusionment. And there is also death. And death, as St. Paul says, is the last enemy. But nevertheless, we all somehow have a memory, a racial memory, of a beautiful garden. You know, I feel, I've said this before here, I remember saying it on Good Friday. I feel that all of us have a love of the garden because we realize that our life began, our earthly career began in a garden. And we also remember that we were redeemed in a garden. That on the last night that our divine Lord spent in this world, that He went to the garden to pray on our behalf, the Garden of Gethsemane. And that there under the olive trees, by the light of the Easter moon, He prayed so intensely for us that great sweat came down His face like drops of blood. That was the agony in the garden. So there again in a garden, His prayers have given us the possibility of redemption. And then there is one other place where He mentioned a garden. You know, the word in Greek, and remember the New Testament was written in Greek. The word in Greek, which means paradise, it's paradisos, and from that word paradisos comes our English word paradise. That word paradise originally meant garden. Long before Christ, 4 centuries before Christ, an expedition from Greece went to fight against the Persians. And they went to what is now called Asia Minor, to an area of great barren deserts. And this group of several thousand Greeks lived in a country where they were always near to the sea, where they could always smell salt water. And they were sent there to that intensely desert, forsaken land. And they wandered for long weeks and long months through this land, trying to reach the sea. And there in the desert, the Greeks felt completely dispirited. The desert horrified them, because they were used to the sea. They were used to water. They were used to flowers. They were used to green fields. And here they were in this dreadful desert. But in those days, the Persians lived there, in that part of the world. It was part of the Persian Empire. And the Persians are the race who always have had a great affection and devotion to gardens. It's said that the rose was originally cultivated in Persia. That the rose is something that originally came from Persia. And the rose is the favorite flower of most of us. It's the flower that we usually on statues see in the arms of our Blessed Lady. And of the little flower, St. Therese of the child Jesus. She it was who said that after her death she would let fall a shower of roses. So the rose came from Persia. And the idea of beautiful gardens came from Persia. I've been in Persia, Iran it now is, where now it's not a very popular country with us because the hostages were held there for a long period. But I saw Persian gardens, and they're beautiful. They're usually fountains and green flowers. I mean green grass and lovely flowers. And there's a peacefulness about them. So the Greeks, on this long trek they had through the desert, discovered these gardens. And they asked the Persians what these gardens were called. And the Persians told them it was Firdos. Firdos. That was the name. And the Greeks couldn't pronounce the F, so they pronounced it Firdos. And from that came the word paradise. And so the word paradise means a garden. And when our Lord was dying on the cross, there were 2 thieves on either side of him. And one thief cursed him and reviled him. But the other thief begged him for mercy. And to that thief, that penitent thief who begged for mercy, our Lord turned and he said those beautiful words, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Today shalt thou be with me in paradise. What a beautiful thing. That penitent thief, that dying thief, was promised by Christ that that very day he would be with him in paradise. In other words, he would be in a garden, the garden of God. And I think you know that all of us have that longing. It goes back to the very beginning of our human existence, to that garden where man originally began, where our long pilgrimage began, that beautiful garden of perfection. That was at the beginning of our existence, but in faith there is another garden that lies at the end of our human pilgrimage, and that is the garden of God, the garden of Christ, the paradise of God. And when we die, when we have passed through the purifying process of purgatory, I believe that those of us who have faith, those of us who keep faith with Christ our Lord, that we shall again be with him in the garden. And when our pilgrimage is over, we shall be dusty, and we shall be tired. We shall be so tired, very tired. And there will be upon us so much of the burden of sin and pain. But in that lost state, we shall enter into the garden of our blessed Lord. And there we shall be with him. And we shall have peace. And we shall have tranquility. And we shall be in the love of his sacred heart. And we shall be with him and with all of our brethren in the communion of saints. We shall be with them forever and forever and forever in the garden. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.